Welcome to the RPTM podcast, the show that breaks down the myths of monolithic history and tells our story through multiple lenses. I'm your host, Professor Ryan Lancaster. Today's episode is partially underwritten by you, the listener. Find out ways to support the podcast on my website, ryanglancaster.com. Episode 14, French and Indian War, Louisiana, and the Stamp Act. Full disclosure, we're going to have a little more self-indulgence on this episode. I was born and raised in Michigan, and as a boy, I would make my way up to the most northern part of the Lower Peninsula to Mackinac Island. This is a typical tourist destination for travelers, as it is next to the bridge that connects the lower and upper peninsulas of Michigan. While most people wanted to gorge themselves on fudge, a familiar staple in the area, I was fascinated by history. On the shores of Lake Michigan, a replicate Fort Michilimackinac had been constructed as a tourist trap, and it did a number on me. I was obsessed with the cannons and the period costumes, and I wanted to know more. If this was something that I had just read about, I would have lost interest instantly. But the interaction with history gave me something tangible to pique my interest. As a boy being selected to lead the King's Men by an actor in a British uniform, I remember getting to order around these troops and getting them to march. This, I realize as I'm saying it, is most likely incredibly lame. But at the same time, I was interacting with history, and it meant so much to me. So much that when I had children of my own, I made sure to bring my wife and kids to see the fort. My youngest son was fascinated with the King's Salt, barrels of salt in the storage of the fort that were labeled properly for the king. This led to a brief discussion on monarchies and the geopolitical landscape of the 18th century. He grabbed his mother by the hand, walked her to the storage room, and stated, "Look, Mom, this is the King's Salt." Who would have thought something so mundane as salt would have led to such a lasting impression? French and Indian War. The French and Indian War is a name given to the North American theater of the 7 Years' War, a global conflict involving Europe's major powers. Though war was not formally declared until 1756, the armed conflict began in 1754 as disputes over land claims in the Ohio Valley led to a series of frontier battles between the French and the British. Both received support from various Native American tribes, though the outnumbered French became far more dependent on these allies as the war progressed. The French saw several early victories, most notably over George Washington and Edward Braddock in western Pennsylvania. Washington quickly became a central figure in the conflict, maturing during his tenure in the Virginia militia from an inexperienced young major to the commander-in-chief of the colony's regiment. Washington's involvement during the war's early stages provided the future president with invaluable military experience, while also gaining him positive notoriety that helped him launch his future political career. The tide turned in favor of the British in 1757 when King George II appointed Secretary of State William Pitt to wartime operations. Pitt believed that securing victories in North America would ensure Britain's global success and reinvigorated the war effort by reorganizing military leadership and strengthening the Crown's relationship with its colonists in America. British assaults on strategic outposts such as Ticonderoga, Niagara, and Quebec in 1759, followed by Montreal's successful siege in September 1760, prompted the French to surrender. Though Britain's victory in the French-Indian War expelled France from North America and secured massive territorial gains for the empire, following Crown policies concerning taxation and westward expansion resulted in widespread colonial discontent. The conflict and its aftermath produced substantial ideological divisions between Britain and her North American colonies that ultimately contributed to American Revolution's outbreak. The French and Indian War was one of many French-British conflicts fought during the Second Hundred Years' War, a historical era that included King William's War, Queen Anne's War, and King George's War. The struggle for control over North America that developed into the French and Indian War materialized in the mid-18th century due to a dispute over French land claims in North America. Between 1700 and 1750, Canada and Louisiana's colonial populations increased significantly, forcing expansion into the Ohio River Valley region. As settlement in this area and the lower Mississippi Valley increased, New France increased her agricultural output and invested heavily in Louisiana's sugar economy. During this period, the French strengthened military ties and existing trade relationships with numerous Indian societies, sparking competition with the British for indigenous allies. By 1749, population growth in the East and a desire for land wealth from colonial elites prompted the Virginia House of Burgesses to issue large grants of land territory in the West to private land companies, such as the Ohio Company. However, competing claims from the French challenged the Ohio Company's planned sale of these lands, prompting the colony of Virginia to initiate efforts towards halting French forts in western Pennsylvania and removing these rivals from the region. In late October 1753, 21-year-old George Washington, a major in the Virginia militia, volunteered to deliver a message to the French on behalf of the colony's governor, Robert Dinwiddie. The injunction ordered that the French halt construction on Fort Le Boeuf in western Pennsylvania and evacuate lands in the Ohio Valley or face an armed attack. George Washington's experience in the French Indian War was a formative one, allowing him to develop from a determined yet inexperienced leader to a distinguished commander of the Virginia militia. Washington did not manage to expel the French from his expedition to Fort Le Boeuf. His lack of a formal military education revealed itself in several tactical blunders during the war's early years. Washington's most famous mistake took place in July of 1754 following the Battle of Fort Necessity, where his surrender unwittingly included an admission that British troops had assassinated a French officer. While these events prompted Washington to resign his commission from the Virginia militia, his heirs gained the attention of officials in London, who shortly after dispatched 2 regiments to North America under the command of Major General Edward Braddock. Furthermore, the publication of Washington's journals from the Le Boeuf expedition, titled The Journal of Major George Washington, illuminated its importance of controlling the Ohio Valley and the necessity of this region in securing Britain's North American empire. This account convinced governmental officials that military force was necessary to remove the French from the western frontier and gained Washington's acclaim on both sides of the Atlantic. This notoriety prompted Washington to return to military service in 1755 as an aide for Braddock's summer expedition to Fort Duquesne. Though this mission ended in defeat, his distinguished services earned Washington a promotion to Commander-in-Chief of the Virginia Militia Forces, a post he held until his resignation in 1758. Weak leadership and disagreements within the British Army plagued Washington's military tenure in the 2 years following the Braddock expedition. Proposals to attack forts in Canada, including Quebec, Niagara, and Duquesne, were dismissed by colonial governors, who often voiced concerns over their commanders' collective lack of active military experience, particularly when compared to their French counterparts. Between 1755 and 1757, these disputes allowed French forces and their Indian allies to capture numerous British forts in New York and Pennsylvania while wreaking havoc in the southern backcountry. Upon taking office in 1757, Secretary of State William Pitt assumed control over British military operations, developing a plan to invigorate the North American war efforts. Pitt's strategy called for the British to finance Prussia's army's expansion, increasing hostilities in Europe and diverting French attention from their colonies. By weakening France's military efforts in the territories and bolstering the number of regular soldiers fighting in North America, the British regained control of the war by 1759, swaying many indigenous groups from their French allegiances and capturing most of the vital outposts protecting Canada. Furthermore, between 1760 and 1762, the British Empire seized nearly every French territory in the Caribbean, adding Cuba in August of 1762 following Spain's official declaration of war. Faced with imminent defeat, France and her allies agreed to negotiations with the British, signing the Treaty of Paris on February 10, 1763. By the conditions of the treaty, France ceded all North American land claims east of the Mississippi River to Great Britain and a few of her West Indian islands and Canada. Spain, France's ally by the Family Compact, received trans-Mississippi Louisiana and control over New Orleans. In return, the Spanish ceded Florida to Great Britain in return for Cuba, which the British had seized in June of the previous year. While these territorial shifts put the whole of eastern North America under British control, much of the populace criticized the terms of the treaty. Objectors argued that by restoring to France the valuable sugar islands of Martinique, St. Lucia, and Guadeloupe, Britain had allowed her to recover, rebuild, and potentially emerge as a military threat in the future. However, supporters praised Britain's treaty negotiations, declaring her empire in North America to be secured and complete finally. Britain's extensive territorial gains often overshadowed the complicated legacies and consequences of the French and Indian War. These geographic shifts triggered an era of social and political change that estranged the crown from much of her colonial citizenry. The British had amassed a substantial amount of debt in fighting the war, and consequently implemented several taxation measures upon the colonies to alleviate the empire's financial burden. These parliamentary taxes, including the Stamp Act and the Townshend Act, incited protests throughout North America and led many colonials to assert that the British Empire threatened their fundamental rights and liberties. Accompanied by discontent over the Proclamation Line of 1763 and the changes made to the management of Indian affairs, tension between the colonists and the crown evolved into outright acts of opposition and rebellion. For the continent's native population, French removed altered, carefully crafted diplomatic practices, particularly the balance of power strategy that had come to define indigenous European political relations over the 18th century. The British-French rivalry had previously provided North American Indians with opportunities to play European nations off and control cross-cultural trade relationships. However, to limit native autonomy and increase indigenous dependence following the Treaty of Paris, the British government used their nearly unchallenged control over North America trade to force native land cessions and adherence to British governmental interests. Such measures eroded relations between the two groups, leading to an alarming increase in Anglo-Indian violence following 1763. Washington's service in the Virginia militia during the French and Indian War provided him with an invaluable education in leadership and military strategy, lessons he relied on in the American Revolution. However, Washington's French and Indian War experience did more than teaching the future president about commanding troops. It reshaped his way about thinking about Britain and her colonies' relationship. Washington had dedicated his career to the Virginia militia toward achieving an equal commission in the British Army. This aspiration never came to fruition by the time of his resignation in 1758. Washington's military experience led him to believe that his commission rejection was not due to the lack of capability, but because the British armed forces regarded colonial militiamen as inferior. Like many of his Virginia counterparts, Washington's political and economic beliefs continued to clash with Crown policies throughout the 1760s, particularly following the Proclamation Line's establishment. His French and Indian War experience reveals the early stages of ideological divergence between specific groups of colonials and their mother country. This division ultimately leads to the outbreak of the American Revolution. Fort Michilimackinac. On a June day in 1763, the commandant of Fort Michilimackinac was invited to watch a game of bagataway between the Ojibwe and the Sauk. The attack on Fort Michilimackinac was executed flawlessly. Under a scorching sun on a late spring day on the Straits of Mackinac, British Major George Etherington, commandant of Fort Michilimackinac, was relaxed at the sidelines of a rousing game of bagataway, which is similar to lacrosse, outside the fort. The major should have seen the danger signs in this Ojibwe versus Sauk contest of sweaty half-naked bodies painted with white clay and charcoal. The 30-year-old officer was born in the colonies and most likely grew up on stories of Indian uprisings. He'd even served in the just-ending French and Indian War, in which the English had wrested control of North America from the French, a victory that had put this previously French fort in Etherington's care. Though the major had been raised on American soil and had fought for it, he was still English. And in that country, a battle was a battle, and a sporting event was a sporting event. Perhaps that explains why the Major missed so many cues. Though well-armed, his garrison of 35 or so soldiers was vastly outnumbered by the hundreds of Indians encamped around it, there to exchange furs and wares, steel tomahawks and knives included, from French-Canadian traders. That there'd been a run of tomahawks of late hadn't seemed to worry the Major. He was only irritated by warnings of the many French-Canadians who lived at the fort that the Indians were planning an uprising. He threatened to have the next person who spread similar gossip locked up at Fort Detroit. The unwitting Etherington had not yet heard that Fort Detroit was under siege, attacked several weeks before by a coalition of tribes led by Pontiac, the Odawa chief. Foreseeing that English domination spelled the end of his people's lifestyle, Pontiac had just begun his famous rebellion. Etherington even refused to listen to the warnings of the esteemed fur trader Charles Langlade, a man of French Indian blood who had fought alongside the Indians since he was a young boy and was widely revered by him. It must have taxed Langlade's charity to warn the Major, as England's control of North America meant that the French monopoly over the fur trade was over. But Langlade had seen what terrors his Native American cousins could unleash on their enemies. Protecting his business interests was not worth shedding that much blood. For his magnanimity, Langlade suffered a scolding from Etherington. Oblivious to all the foreshadowing, when the Ojibwe invited him and his soldiers to watch their match outside the fort, a game they said was in celebration of the king's birthday, Etherington accepted, probably donning his white wig. After all, it was a formal event. He then gathered most of the garrison to watch with them. According to the Major's account written later, they left the gates open and their weapons back in the fort. Etherington cheered for the Ojibwe along with the two chiefs of that tribe. After all, the Major had bet with the Ojibwe would win. With some 500 players, the game must have looked more like a battle. In the fur, Etherington didn't miss Charles Langlade. He was inside his home in the fort with his family, and Etherington barely noticed the Indian women lingering at the fort gates, wrapped tightly in bulky blankets, as if the day was cold and the calendar did not read June 2nd, 1763. It happened in seconds. A frenzy of sweaty, painted bodies clamoring for the leather-wrapped chunk of wood that was the ball as it fell at the mouth of the open gate. The women opening their blankets and handing off knives and tomahawks to the athletes turned warriors. Shrieks, screams, and blood. Etherington and his lieutenant, William Leslie, whisked off to the woods, as the other fort officers and likely the only soldier armed that day, Lieutenant Jamnet, was killed. The plan was so carefully laid by cohorts of Pontiac, it was executed flawlessly. The attack and the events that followed were recorded in the painfully descriptive memoirs of Alexander Henry, who, at the time of the attack, was a young English fur trader staying at the fort. Going instantly to my window, I saw a crowd of Indians within the fort furiously cutting down every Englishman they found, Henry wrote. Henry, observing that the Indians were killing only English and sparing the French Canadians, ran next door to Langlade's home for help. When Henry pleaded for help, the trader answered in French, "What do you want me to do about it?" Fortunately for Henry, Langlade's Indian slave girl hid with him in the attic. Henry watched the scene unfold on the fort grounds below him from a hole in the attic wall. The next day, the Indians rooted Henry from his hiding place. For the young Englishman, the following days played out in a contest of life or death. Immediately after his capture, he and other prisoners were paddled off towards Beaver Island. Quaking with the cold of a damp north wind and famished, Henry turned down the chunks of bread his captors offered him, cut with knives stained in blood that the taunting Ojibwe moistened with their spit and smeared on the bread. Fog forced the canoe instead to the Ottawa encampment at the present site of Cross Village, and a surprising turn of events unfolded. Angered that they had not been invited to participate in the massacre, the Ottawa seized Henry and the other captives and paddled them back to the fort, where they had just taken control. A consultation between the tribes sent Henry and the other prisoners back to the Ojibwe. But Henry was spared by a quirk of fate. The winter before, an Ojibwe by the name of Wawantum had unexpectedly adopted him as his brother, asserting that the Great Spirit had told him in a vision years earlier to make an Englishman his brother. Wawantum recognized Henry's face as the face from his dream. Fortunately for Henry, the Indians stepped forward to convince his tribal leaders to spare Henry and to put the traitor in his charge. Safe in Wawantum's lodge, Henry looked out the next day to see 7, by his count, of the men with whom he'd been held captive dead, victims of a chief who, having been away during the attack, wanted to seek his vengeance on the English. All told, though small discrepancies existed within accounts, at least 27 Englishmen were killed in the attack and its aftermath, and another dozen or so were still held captive. Among the captured were Etherington and Leslie, who had been stripped and locked in the fort. When the Ottawa arrived with Henry and his fellow captives, they allowed Etherington to send an Ottawa canoe courier, a plea for help to James Gorrell, commandant at the fort at what is now Green Bay, Wisconsin. Ottawa's cooperation with Etherington wasn't at all about their anger at the Ojibwe. They probably calculated that a major would bring an excellent ransom. Gorrell, an astute officer who had won the alliance of the tribes around his fort, gathered 90 Indians in a small garrison and paddled across Lake Michigan to negotiate Etherington's release, with Langlade's help. In mid-July, Etherington, Leslie, and the other prisoners were headed for Montreal, escorted by a brigade of Ottawa. After their departure, Fort Michilimackinac emptied except for a handful of French traders. Langlade, who was among them, assumed charge. The Indians had dissolved into the North Woods, both to head up their winter hunting grounds and to hide from British retribution. Brand as it was, the Ojibwe coup at Fort Michilimackinac was an empty victory. Though they had took the fort, the Indians never wanted it. Their goal, like Pontiac's, was to drive the English and their settlements out of Native American hunting, fishing, and trapping grounds, a defiant attempt to save their doomed lifestyle. By the following June, 3,000 British troops marched from Fort Niagara, New York, to Fort Detroit to secure victory over Pontiac and his tribes, whose siege had fizzled out the fall before. A detachment would then head to Fort Michilimackinac after a harrowing year spent avoiding death through the grace of his adopted Indian family. Alexander Henry had finally made it to the fort's safety in New York and joined the march to Detroit. With the British reclamation of the Straits virtually assured, Henry wanted to recover goods he'd left behind when he fled. In September, the British detachment, Henry included, made it to Fort Michilimackinac, where they reclaimed the fort with no bloodshed. That peace, of course, was only a pause in a much larger struggle for control of North America. By 1776, just 13 years after the deadly game of Bagataway, Langlade's loyalties and many of their French and Indian peers from the Great Lakes region had shifted dramatically. They fought with the British in an alliance against their new, shared enemy, the Americans. The Proclamation Line of 1763. The Proclamation Line of 1763 was a British-produced boundary marked in the Appalachian Mountains at the Eastern Continental Divide. On October 7, 1763, the Proclamation Line prohibited Anglo-American colonists from settling on lands acquired from the French following the French and Indian War. This measure advanced British governmental efforts to discourage westward expansion in the decade before the American Revolution, an objective motivated by several socio-political and economic factors. Officials in London feared that the increased Anglo-American presence in the Western Territory would encourage Native American violence that would incite another expensive conflict for the empire when paired with the resistance from French settlers in the region. The British government also viewed westward expansion as a threat to their mercantile economic system, expressing concern that opening up the West to farming families would provide the colonies with opportunity to gain financial independence through commercial agriculture. While Britain intended for the boundary line to alleviate tensions between Anglo settlers and indigenous peoples, eager colonists largely ignored the proclamation. They settled beyond the boundary with few consequences from the government. The Royal Proclamation was more successful in restricting the aims of private Virginia-based land companies and their investors who sought to capitalize on the sale of lands in the Ohio Valley. As a Virginia gentry member, a patron of numerous land companies, and an established surveyor, the boundary line profoundly affected George Washington. Washington deemed the Royal Proclamation's control on trade and migration discriminatory against colonials seeking to alleviate personal debts through profitable land holdings, particularly veterans of the French and Indian War. As many of Washington's counterparts shared these views, the Proclamation Line of 1763 was significant in that it marked the beginning of a clear ideological break with the mother country. The divergent social, political, and economic perspectives that emerged among Virginia's wealthy elite ultimately helped push the colony to rebellion in the following decade. The end of the French and Indian War brought significant geographic and political changes to North America. The Treaty of Paris, signed on February 10, 1763, effectively removed France from the continent, forcing her to cede all territories east of the Mississippi River to the victor, Great Britain. In gaining these land holdings, the British declared their American colonies to be complete and secure from external threats. However, this post-war agreement produced numerous internal challenges that induced the Crown to establish the Proclamation Line. Immediately following the Treaty of Paris, inhabitants from the Empire's Atlantic colonies assumed these newly acquired lands were free and open for settlement. Many moved west of the Appalachian Mountains. Triggered by settler encroachment and angered over Britain's suppressive diplomatic policies, a loose confederacy of Indians from the Ohio Valley and Great Lakes region attacked several British forts and settlements to defend their lands, preserve their political autonomy, and traditional ways of life. This uprising, known as Pontiac's Rebellion, quickly spread, reaching the Illinois country and Virginia by 1763. As Native American war parties destroyed dozens of British forts and killed hundreds of civilians, America's retaliatory aggression illuminated the need to segregate both groups. Though the British government assured its American citizens that the Proclamation Line was enacted for their protection, many interpreted the act as a pro-Indian measure. In restricting Anglo-American settlement beyond the Appalachians and prohibiting governors from transferring Native American lands to private companies or individuals unless previously acquired by Great Britain through an official treaty, the Crown formally acknowledged that the Native Americans possessed certain land rights, evoking widespread colonial discontent and frustration. Britain's desire to maintain its mercantile economic system also encouraged the creation of the Proclamation Line. Within the British mercantile world, colonies were to produce raw materials for export to the mother country. They would be produced into manufactured goods and sold to consumers within the empire. To keep her wealth internalized, Great Britain enacted several regulations throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, such as the Navigation Acts, prohibiting her colonies from trading with foreign markets. Following the French and Indian War, Britain feared that westward expansion would lead to commercial agricultural growth, allowing farmers to profit by smuggling excess crops to external Atlantic markets. Instead, the government sought to protect mercantilism by encouraging colonial growth to the north and south to populate the newly acquired provinces of Quebec, East Florida, and West Florida. This would limit the establishment of commercially profitable farms on freshly claimed western lands and keep settlers within close range of Britain's economic and political influence. Consequently, many colonials of varying socioeconomic backgrounds viewed the Proclamation Line and its restrictions as repressive measures put in place by the Crown to secure increased control over affairs in the North American colonies. Pontiac's War. Pontiac's rebellion began when a Native American warriors' confederacy under Ottawa Chief Pontiac attacks the British force at Detroit. After failing to take the fort in their initial assault, Pontiac's forces, made up of Ottawas reinforced by Wyandots, Ojibways, and Potawatomis, instigated a siege that would stretch into months. As the French and Indian Wars came to an end in the early 1760s, Native Americans living in former French territories found the British authorities far less conciliatory than their predecessors. In 1763, Pontiac enlisted support from practically every Indian tribe from Lake Superior to the lower Mississippi for a joint campaign to expel British from their formerly French lands. According to Pontiac's plan, each tribe would seize the nearest fort and join forces to wipe out the undefended settlements. In April, Pontiac convened a war council on the banks of the Ecorse River near Detroit. It was decided that Pontiac and his warriors would gain access to the British fort at Detroit under the pretense of negotiating a peace treaty, allowing them to seize the arsenal forcibly there. However, British Major Henry Gladwin learned of the plot, and the British were ready for Pontiac's arrival in early May, and Pontiac was forced to begin a siege. Simultaneously, his allies in Pennsylvania started a siege at Fort Pitt. Other sympathetic tribes, such as Delaware, the Shawnee, and the Seneca, prepared to move against various British forts and outposts in Michigan, New York, Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Virginia. On July 31st, a British relief expedition attacked Pontiac's camp but suffered heavy losses and was repelled in Bloody Run's battle. Nevertheless, they succeeded in providing the fort at Detroit with the reinforcements and supplies, which allowed it to hold out against the Indians into the fall. The significant forts at Pitt and Niagara likewise held on, but the united tribes captured 8 other fortified posts. The garrisons were wiped out at these forts. Relief expeditions were repulsed, and nearby frontier settlements were destroyed. In 1764, 2 British armies were sent out, one into Pennsylvania and Ohio under Colonel Bouquet, and the other to the Great Lakes under Colonel John Bradstreet. Bouquet's campaign met with success, and the Delawares and Shawnee were forced to sue for peace, breaking Pontiac's alliance. Failing to persuade tribes in the West to join his rebellion and lacking the French hoped for support, Pontiac finally signed a treaty with the British in 1766. In 1769, he was murdered by Peoria Indians while visiting Illinois. His death led a bitter warfare among the tribes, and the Peorias were nearly wiped out. Louisiana. The Treaty at Fontainebleau was a secret agreement in 1762 in which the Kingdom of France ceded Louisiana to Spain. The treaty followed the last battle in the French and Indian War in North America, the battle at Signal Hill in September 1762, which confirmed Canada's British control. In Europe, the associated 7 Years' War continued to rage. Having lost Canada, King Louis XV of France proposed to King Charles III of Spain that France should give Spain the country known as Louisiana, as well as New Orleans and the islands in which the city is situated. Charles accepted on November 13, 1762. This agreement covered all of Louisiana, the Mississippi River's entire valley, from the Appalachians to the Rockies. The Treaty of Fontainebleau was kept secret even during the French negotiation and signing of the Treaty of Paris, which ended the war with Britain. The Treaty of Paris between France and Great Britain allowed the 7 Years' Wars divided Louisiana at the Mississippi. The eastern half was ceded to Britain, and France nominally retained the western half and New Orleans. Spain did not contest Britain's control of East Louisiana, as it already knew that it would not rule West Louisiana. Also, under the Treaty of Paris, Spain had ceded Florida to Britain, for which the western Louisiana was in compensation. The Treaty of Paris provided 18 months in which French colonists who did not want to live under British rule could freely emigrate to other French colonies. Many immigrants moved to Louisiana, where they discovered later that France had ceded Louisiana to Spain. The colonists in western Louisiana did not accept the transition and expelled the first Spanish governor in 1768. Alejandro O'Reilly suppressed the rebellion. O'Reilly made good Spain's occupancy title by taking formal possession in 1769 by raising the Spanish flag. The acquisition of Louisiana consolidated the Spanish Empire in North America. When Great Britain returned Florida to Spain in 1783, Spanish territory completely encircled the Gulf of Mexico after the American Revolutionary War. It stretched from Florida west to the Pacific Ocean and north to Canada west of the Mississippi River. The government of Louisiana lived in New Orleans, capital of Lower Louisiana, but had representatives or commandants in St. Louis, Missouri, capital of Upper Louisiana, also named Illinois Country, since Spain obtained that Louisiana. During the Louisiana Spanish period, many Spanish settlers emigrated to this region. The more known Spanish emigration happened between 1778 and 1783, when the governor of Louisiana, Bernardo de Galvez, recruited groups from the Canary Islands and the Magallanes Spanish region and sent them to Louisiana to populate New Orleans. So, more than 2,700 Canaries and 500 Magallanes natives emigrated to Louisiana during this period. In 1800, Spain returned Louisiana to France, although it sold it to the U.S. in 1803. The descendants of Spanish settlers still live there. The Stamp Act. The Stamp Act of 1765 was the first internal tax levied directly on American colonists by the British Parliament. The act, which imposed a tax on all paper documents in the colonies, came when the British Empire was deep in debt from the 7 Years' War and looking to its North American colonies as revenue source. Arguing that their only representative assemblies could tax them, the colonists insisted that the act was unconstitutional and that it resorted to mob violence to intimidate stamp collectors into resigning. Parliament passed the Stamp Act on March 22, 1765, and repealed it in 1766, but issued a declaratory act at the same time to reaffirm its authority to pass any colonial legislation it saw fit. The issues of taxation and representation raised by the Stamp Act strained relations with the colonies to the point that, 10 years later, the colonists rose up in armed rebellion against the British. British Parliament passed the Stamp Act to help replenish their finances after the costly 7 Years' War with France. Part of the Stamp Act revenue would be used to maintain several regiments of British soldiers in North America to maintain peace between Native Americans and the colonists. Moreover, since colonial juries had proven notoriously reluctant to find smugglers guilty of the crimes, violators of the Stamp Act could be tried and convicted without juries in the Vice Admiralty's courts. The 7 Years' War ended the long rivalry between France and Britain for North America's control, leaving Britain in possession of Canada and France without a footing on the continent. Victory in the war, however, had saddled the British Empire with tremendous debt. Since the war benefited the American colonists, who had suffered 80 years of intermittent warfare with the French neighbors, as much as anyone else in the British Empire, the British government decided that those colonists should be part of the war's cost. Britain had long regulated colonial trade through a system of restrictions and duties on imports and exports. In the first half of the 18th century, however, the British enforcement of the system had been lax. Starting with the Sugar Act of 1764, which imposed new duties on sugar and other goods, the British government began to tighten its reins on the colonies. Shortly after that, George Grenville, the British First Lord of the Treasury and Prime Minister, proposed the Stamp Act. Parliament passed the act without debate in 1765. Stamp Act opponent Patrick Henry is known for his "Give me liberty or give me death" speech, delivered before a meeting of Virginia's colonial leaders in 1775 to mobilize a militia against a possible British attack. He served later as Virginia's governor. Instead of levying a duty on trade goods, the Stamp Act imposed a direct tax on the colonists. Specifically, the act required that starting in the fall of 1765, legal documents and printed materials must bear a stamp tax provided by commissioned distributors who would collect the tax in exchange for the stamp. The law applied to wills, deeds, newspapers, pamphlets, and even playing cards and dice. Coming amid economic hardships in the colonies, the Stamp Act roused vehement resistance. Although most colonists continued to accept Parliament's authority to regulate their trade, they insisted that only the representative assemblies could levy direct internal taxes, such as the one imposed by the Stamp Act. They rejected the British government's argument that all British subjects enjoyed virtual representation in Parliament, even though they could not vote for Parliament members. The colonists also took exception to the provision denying offenders trial by jury. A vocal minority hinted at dark designs behind the Stamp Act. These radical voices warned that the tax was part of a gradual plot to deprive the colonists of their freedom and enslave them beneath an authoritarian regime. Playing off the traditional fears of peacetime armies, he wondered aloud why Parliament would fit to garrison troops in North America only after the French threat had been removed. These concerns provided an ideological basis that intensified colonial resistance. Parliament pushed forward with the Stamp Act despite the colonists' objections. Colonial resistance to the act mounted slowly at first, but gained momentum as its implementation's planned date drew near. In Virginia, Patrick Henry, whose fiery orations against the British tyranny would soon make him famous, submitted a series of resolutions to his colony's assembly, the House of Burgess. These resolutions denied Parliament's right to tax the colonies and called on the colonists to resist the Stamp Act. Newspapers throughout the colonies reprinted the resolutions, spreading their radical message to a broad audience. The resolutions provided the tenure of the Stamp Act's Congress proclamations, an extra-legal convention composed of delegates from 9 colonies that met in October 1765. The Stamp Act Congress wrote petitions to the king affirming both their loyalties and the conviction that only the colonial assemblies had the constitutional authority to tax the colonists. While Congress and the colonial assemblies passed resolutions and issued petitions against the Stamp Act, the colonists took matters into their own hands. The most famous popular resistance took place in Boston, where opponents of the Stamp Act, calling themselves the Sons of Liberty, enlisted Boston's rabble in opposition to the new law. This mob paraded through the streets with an effigy of Andrew Oliver, Boston's stamp distributor, which they hung from the Liberty Tree and beheaded before ransacking Oliver's home. Oliver agreed to resign his commission as a stamp distributor. Similar events transpired in other colonial towns, as crowds mobbed the stamp distributors and threatened their physical well-being and property. By the beginning of 1763, most of the stamp distributors had resigned their commissions, many of them under duress. Mobs in seaport towns turned away ships carrying the stamped papers from England without allowing them to discharge their cargoes. Determined colonial resistance made it impossible for the British government to bring the Stamp Act to effect. In 1766, Parliament repealed it. The end of the Stamp Act did not end Parliament's conviction that it had the authority to impose taxes on the colonists. British government coupled the repeal of the Stamp Act with the Declaratory Act, a reformation of its power to pass any laws over the colonists as it saw fit. However, the colonists held firm in their view that Parliament could not tax them. The issue raised by the Stamp Act festered for 10 years before giving rise to the Revolutionary War and ultimately American independence. You've been listening to the RPTM podcast. If you like what you hear, Please rate us on whatever platform you're listening on. Join us again next week when we talk about the seen and unseen of U.S. history. Make sure you subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. Also, for more information, check out the show notes on my website. The show was produced by me. Our editor is me. Written and researched by me. Music is Down South by Bliv Beats. I'm Ryan Lancaster, and this was the RPTM podcast.